Here is John Bolton. For 65, 70 years, I think it was now. 59. I can't do the math. Maybe 50 years. Let's call it just some 50-odd years. We had an embargo with Cuba. We had travel restrictions to Cuba. I traveled in about 18 years ago, 2001, I think it was, maybe 2002, under a special OFAC license, some office in the Treasury, where you could go if there was a clear educational purpose or something like that. I was down there shooting a documentary, and with my ex-wife, and I think that's available online somewhere. But but since that time, during the Obama administration, these travel restrictions were lifted. People were able to see relatives that they hadn't seen in ages. Americans were able to go down there, and tourism increased. Obviously, there's a lot of European tourism already. But over the course of those 50 years, the embargo did not work. The inability to allow for direct travel to Cuba did not work. The theory behind it was, we are going to try and put such stress on the government that it collapses. And when it collapses in chaos, rather than any type of orderly unwinding, as it were, or anything like that, those people who had been dispossessed of their property that they had garnered during the Batista regime would get that property back. And not all of that property was garnered through corruption, but there was a tremendous amount of corruption in that society prior to that. And that was basically the hope. That is why there were a lot of members, expats in the Cuban community, who were hoping that the way the Cuban government would end would be in an implosion, in a catastrophic event, because that was the way that they would get back in there. And it simply did not happen. When the Soviet Union fell, Cuba suffered significantly. A lot of their economy was propped up by the Soviet Union. They worked their way out of it. There certainly was a healthy dose of political repression in Cuba, and certainly human rights violations, I think you could argue. There was also, and it was certainly a dictatorship. People were afraid of what they could say publicly in many respects. I experienced that firsthand. There was also a lot of, social services and support. I mean, certainly like Castro would bring in from rural areas. It was fascinating because there was a lot of parallels along with what the Bush administration was. But he would bring in policemen from the rural areas to be police in Havana and some of the other cities, because they were naturally skeptical of city dwellers. There was a lot of propaganda. There were other attributes of the society that were envious. Literacy rates, healthcare, respects. So a mixed bag, but certainly the U.S. policy of embargo and travel restriction only made Cuba suffer more. Cuban people, and did not have the desired outcome. So what better reason do you need to institute it if that's the case? Here is John Bolton trying to get some votes in Florida for the president in 2020.
We are also announcing that the Department of the Treasury will implement further regulatory changes to restrict non-family travel to Cuba, or in other words,
So there he is in Coral Gables, Florida, talking to a group of elderly Cubans. I don't need to see them to know that they're a group of elderly Cubans.
He responds like that's the first applause he's ever gotten in his life.
That's true.
Really?
So travel restrictions re-implemented in Cuba. Families apparently still go there, but of course it'll be a little bit trickier because you don't get the same amount of flights that are going because only families are there. And who knows how Cuba will respond to that and make it difficult. So what's old is new again because it was so successful the first time.